Hello everybody, thank you for joining us this evening for this emergency handling workshop. This is brought to you this evening by Astral Aviation Consulting, also along with the Civil Aviation Authority. It's great to see so many of you here this evening, and I hope you'll get a lot out of this. My name is Chris Kidd. I'm the Director of Astral Aviation Consulting, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with us, we're an aviation consulting firm that are contracted by the UK CAA to provide you with safety resources through a dedicated GA safety campaign, which this workshop is part of. If you want to stay up in the loop with events and stuff that's coming up and the resources, please do sign up to our mailing list, and you can do this by going to our website, www.astralaviationconsulting.com. That link is going to go in the chat box now, so please feel free to do that. That'd be great. We'd love to see more of you. I'm delighted to be joined once again this evening by Matt Lane, who's the head of training and an active single multi-engine flight examiner and flight instructor, and he's the head of training for RAF Sport Aviation. I'm also very pleased to be joined this evening by Steve Slater, the CEO of the Light Aircraft Association. Good evening to both of you.
Hi, good evening, Bob. Good evening, everybody.
Okay, over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to break the workshop down as we do traditionally into 3 sections. So in section 1, I'm going to cover off how to approach airborne emergencies. In section 2, Steve's going to cover what to do in the event of an emergency. And then finally, Matt will discuss some common emergency handling pitfalls. And of course, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. As always, there's going to be some polls that can pop up. So it's going to be over to you to be interactive in this, and we'd love for you to be interactive throughout. So please do contribute to the polls. Also, if you've got any comments and things you'd like to pick up on, any observations, any experiences you'd like to share, then please pop those in the chat box, and then we'll pick up on those as we go through. And then finally, if you do have any questions and you'd like to us to answer them at the end, then please put them in the Q&A box. And again, we'll endeavour to pick those up at the end, or maybe even try and do a bit of them as we go through. So then, without further ado, let's start looking at how to approach airborne emergencies. So we put our heads together on this one and decided, how we're going to do this. An airborne emergency happens to you. What do you do first? Well, the first thing we thought to do in the event of an airborne emergency, or even one on the ground for that matter, is to stay in control and not do anything. Basically, don't do anything rash. Pause, look around the aircraft, assess the situation, try to diagnose the problem and understand what's just happened. Has the engine stopped? Have you hit something? Have you lost all your comms? If you did hit something, where did it hit the aircraft? Are you still in control flight? Taking the time, maybe only a few seconds, to work out what's happened will be invaluable later on, as misdiagnosing the issue could cause problems further down the line. Throughout the diagnosis of the situation, of course, you must remember to fly the aircraft. Try not to get distracted by the non-normal situation that's just occurred. And of course, the worst situation you can be in then is get distracted, get distracted by the non-normal situation, and ultimately lose control of the aircraft, ultimately ending up in a much worse situation than you started with. And then finally, when your diagnosis is complete and the aircraft's under control, you need to declare that emergency. Talk to air traffic if you can, and they will swing into action to help you. So this is all well and good, but however, as you know, some emergencies are more time sensitive than others, or more critical than others. So before I get into the detail on this, let's start with a quick poll. In a time-sensitive emergency, or a time-critical emergency, a critical emergency, what would you do first? Well, obviously, you've secured the aircraft, you're flying the aeroplane now, so you've got it under control. But in terms of checklists, would you A, run through the memory items only, B, get the checklist out straight away and flick to the page that you need, C, run through the memory items, then use the checklist to confirm them, or D, get a passenger to read the checklist for you. Again, as with all our polls, no right or wrong answer on this one, just really looking to gauge your thoughts and your ideas. And of course, for those of you that have had emergencies in the air or indeed on the ground, to leverage your experience from that. Okay, so let's have a look at the results. So 26% of you going with A, run through the memory items only. 5% going to get the checklist out straight away. 64% saying run through the memory items, then use the checklist to confirm them. And then finally, a 5% with get the passenger to read the checklist to you. Again, as I mentioned, there's no wrong answer to that. Interesting enough, I'm partial to a bit of C myself. I do learn my memory items. Obviously, that's why they're memory items. But I always tend to, at a moment, if I can, if there is time, then I'll get the checklist out to double check them. We'll hear more from Steve later. And for those of you that have had a look on our website recently, we'll see a great article from Steve, and who's got a lot of experience in this field, as it turns out, from having an engine failure. So we'll see whether he had any of that spare capacity available to then run back through his checklist at the time, or whether it was all fully memory items only. So we shall see for the voice of experience. Great, thanks for your contribution there. Right, let's move on to the next slide then. What have we got next? Let's look at time-sensitive emergencies. So who can give me some examples of time-sensitive or time-critical emergencies? Please put them in the chat box now, and then we'll cover them off at the end of this section. A time-sensitive or critical emergency pretty much is one where if you don't act quickly, including the title really, then it's likely to lead to a catastrophic consequence. So these emergencies are generally associated with checklist memory drills. Funny old thing, that's why they're memory items and they need to be done promptly. But why are they memory drills, and do I really need to know them? So I would say, and I think the people on the panel would also agree with me, that yes, you should know your memory drills off by heart. And the reason they're memory drills in the first place is that so the initial actions can be carried out without delay to secure the aircraft and avoid that catastrophic situation developing. For example, a mech failure might require closing the mixture and fuel cock without delay to firstly shut the engine down, and secondly to halt the flow of fuel to it, therefore presenting, for example, a subsequent fire. These items for the drill should be committed to memory and done without delay, of course. But then, sometimes there may be more to that drill, and of course that's where, going back to answer C from the poll, it's always worth getting the checklist out, double checking those memory items have been done correctly, and then doing any of the follow-on actions required. So, for example, the follow-on actions might be something like switching off the ignition, ELT on, squawking emergency code. For example, in a twin aircraft, you might need further fuel system selections, which actually could be quite complex, and they're not going to be memory items. They're going to be things that you're going to have to look for from the cards. This is where, going back to another answer from our polls, that's where maybe you want to utilize one of the passengers, to hold the checklist, maybe read it to you as you're doing the actions. Worth thinking about. Okay, so I've asked you for a bit of stuff. Let's have a little look what we've got in the chat box here. Excuse me while I maneuver my computer around. So what have we got? We've got FARTO. That's pretty, so engine failure to take off. That's pretty critical, pretty time sensitive. You're not getting away from that quickly, are you? Control cable failure, engine failure, structural failure, smoke in the cockpit, fuel, engine fire. So I'm assuming that's fuel leak, or engine problems, engine fire. Engine sudden reduced power on takeoff, someone's got none yet. Long may that continue. What else we got? Failure of aircraft controls, airframe failure, engine failure. It's all good stuff. So we did a little list, funny old thing, and that's kind of what we come up with there. So you can see engine failure, mech fail, an engine fire in the cockpit, smoke and fumes, or a fuel leak. There will be many more, I'm sure. And of course, these are dependent on where you are. If it's getting towards darkness and you have a electrical failure while during broad daylight, that's not necessarily an issue. It might actually become time sensitive for you, so they can be situationally dependent as well. Right then, let's have a look at some non-time sensitive emergencies. So as you can see those on the screen, that's kind of what we came up with as well. And of course, these emergencies do, and they can occur, but the likelihood of catastrophic failure or catastrophic outcome is somewhat reduced, other than, certainly not as much as the ones you saw on the previous slide. Because, if you don't act quickly, it's unlikely to lead to further issues. They can, however, as I mentioned just now, be situationally dependent, as per the electrical example I just gave you. But also, a lot of the time, they can be dealt with slow time, right? The worst thing people can do, or pilots can do in these sorts of situations, is have a radio failure, for example, and they get completely absorbed by trying to solve the radio failure, complete distraction, at which point we then end up creating a catastrophic failure or an emergency situation out of something which actually could be quite benign. And of course, many of you fly an aircraft that don't have radios. So if you don't have a radio, So if you have a radio failure in a radio equipped aircraft, talk to your mates who fly aircraft without radios. One thing you'll have noticed, the more eagle-eyed amongst you, excuse the pun, is that we have not included bird strikes on either of these slides. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Are they time sensitive, do you think, or non-time sensitive? Stick them in the chat box. Let us know what you think. Okay, let's have a look. Let's move on to checklist then. So we talked about memory items earlier, and this is the kind of thing you're going to see in a typical emergency checklist, which many of you have got, I'm sure. The items that are carried out as memory drills are highlighted with a black sidebar. For example, on the engine failure and the crash infarto drills you can see on the screen now. You can always use the checklist to confirm you've done the actions if time permits, which is what we talked about earlier. Let's do the memory items, get the checklist out, double check that you've done them correctly or you haven't missed anything, and then if there are any follow-on or subsequent actions, then use the checklist for those. I'm going to talk to you about something now called emergency of the day. So we're trying to encourage people to do this. Emergency of the day basically is, you've got a handful of emergencies in the back of your checklist. How frequently do you look at those? We're pretty good at our normal drills, aren't we? Starting the aircraft, pre-takeoff checks, pre-landing checks, all that sort of stuff. How often do you actually look at those? Do you commit your memory items to memory? We would advocate certainly that, before you go flying, why don't you just refresh yourself on those drills? Sometimes even maybe sitting in the cockpit prior to engine start and doing some touch drills. Where is that mixture cut off? How am I going to turn the transponder to emergency, etc.? Because that can save you valuable time in a situation which all of a sudden is getting out of control and that you're not used to. Because of course the last thing you want to be doing, if and when you do have an emergency, is scrabbling around trying to find the drill in the back of the checklist. And because of course the last time you looked at the checklist was 6 months ago before when you started flying again. So why not before every flight, pick an emergency and try and remind yourselves of these three things. So firstly, what are the memory items? Then have a read of any follow-on items. I mean, you don't need to commit them to memory, but it's not bad to know them. And also, where was it in the checklist? Which page was it? Was it easy to find? Some people even then end up tabbing up the checklist with little markers so that in the case of a time critical emergency, they can get straight to that page. Right then. So it's a difficult one though, isn't it? Because certainly if you fly different aircraft, because some of the drills can be subtly different. So what I ended up used to do to learn my memory items on different aircraft was write them out. Okay, and it's a bit time consuming, I know, and maybe a bit too laborious, but I used to write them out, and that really helped me to commit them to memory. Then once I had them committed to memory, I would take the time to sit in the cockpit and do those touch drills. And if I got them wrong, it's fine. I just keep doing it until I was comfortable with I knew where everything was, and I could actually. So I was really honing in on those memory drills. So not only did I know what the drill said, I knew where my hands needed to move. And Matt's going to talk about this later when know your flows, where my hands needed to move to make stuff happen for that particular aircraft. And of course, all aircraft are different. And in some cases, if you're flying club aircraft, slight subtle differences in the aircraft can mean things can be in different places. So worth preparing for that, because the more you can prepare on the ground, if and when that happens in the air, then the better prepared you're going to be for it, right? So it's one of those things. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what we've got in the chat, and then I'll hand over to Steve. So what we've got in the chat here. Yeah, flying a permit aircraft, you might not have a checklist, a neat checklist, that's correct, or a pilot operating handbook. So I think we probably commend at that stage to, maybe even create your own, with guidance, because it's never a bad thing to be able to have something to refer to, because when everything's gone catastrophically wrong, and Steve's going to give us a great bit on this later, that is when you kind of need these things, yeah? What else we got in here? I like to check the expanded procedures, section 3 of the pilot operating handbook. They give good info that a checklist doesn't. That's a good point, actually, because a lot of the pilot operating handbooks have got the more technical and the more in-depth detail in them, haven't they, around all the emergencies? And then they're not transported into the checklist necessarily, are they? So yeah, that's a really good, a really worthwhile thing to do. What's another friend's had a bird strike in the circuit, not time critical, but pretty scary. No, absolutely. Particularly if, if you're on short final, for example, or you've just taken off, hitting a bird that close to the ground, you've got to prioritize what's going on. And like you say, sometimes it might not necessarily be time critical, unless you're leaking fuel, for example. But you do have time to deal with it, but it can be very distracting, particularly in a critical phase of flight, such as takeoff or landing. Yeah. Okay. Great. Keep that chat coming in. Oh, I managed okay when I lost one of the gull wing doors. That sounds pretty bad. Yeah. Good luck with that. Right. That's enough of me droning on. I'm going to hand over to Steve now, who, apart from talking about his amazing DIT, is going to talk to us what to do in the event of an emergency. So, what to do in the event of an emergency occurring to you. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Chris. And first of all, while we're looking at that, we were looking at the checklist on the screen there. If I saw the comments regarding a permit aircraft not having a pilot's operating handbook or a checklist, you can make your own. You can adapt one from another type of aircraft, but you can do that and put all your speeds on and everything else, and it's nothing to stop you doing it. And in fact, a lot of people with permit aircraft do that, and I have got one for various odd and interesting aeroplanes that I've been lucky enough to fly over the years, and I've made my own little checklists and certainly an emergency list to commit to memory at very least. So I'm very lucky that what I tend to fly has tended to have been a very, very simple aircraft. They're not variable pitch props, they're not fuel injected, they're not retractable gear or anything like that. So let's go very quickly then to the second of our polls. And if we can put the poll onto the screen. So what do you consider to be the most important aspect of dealing with an emergency? Is it completing an emergency drill, communicating with air traffic, navigating, or flying the aircraft? And we'll take a couple of minutes while you fill in your responses. And Chris, when you're ready, if you think everyone's responded, we'll have a look and see what the poll has said.
Here we go.
And we said earlier that there wasn't a wrong answer on this. This is probably one where we might just say that it is a clear outcome, and that is if you've got an aeroplane in the air, you're going to fly it, because if you don't, it's going to be an even worse outcome than whatever the emergency gives you. So we use the terms aviate, navigate, and communicate, and whether that's a helicopter, a glider, a flex wing, a conventional light aircraft, it doesn't make any difference. They all are the same. One little comment I would make is try and think about how you might reduce your workload if you certainly have that startle factor of an emergency. And if we go on to the next slide, Chris, you're sat there, you're aviating, all of a sudden something has gone wrong. It may be the door opening, it may be a crack in the windscreen, it may be something's gone bang and hit the aeroplane, it may be the engine stopped or whatever. But the most important thing is keep that aeroplane flying. And one little hint, if you're flying a typical club Cessna 152, or I don't know about the detail on the PA-28, but you should be able to do something similar. Memorize how many, if you close the throttle, practice an engine failure, then memorize how many thumps on the trim wheel you need to get the aeroplane into a safe flying speed. Cessna 152, got the trim wheel down on your on your right hand side here. Bang it downwards 5 times in succession. Just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that will set you up pretty close to the best glide speed. And I've had that demonstrated, and it seems to work every time. So it's one of just taking a little bit of workload away from you. If you do that instinctively, you'll have the aeroplane somewhere near the best glide speed. And you've got to fly an aeroplane through the emergency. I think it was Bob Hoover, the American display pilot, said, fly the aeroplane all the way to the accident. Got a far better chance of an outcome hitting the ground in some form of control than you have if you're out of control. And it may be a non-catastrophic emergency, electric failure. Keep the aeroplane flying while you deal with the situation. What you don't want to do is add a loss of control to it. Second one, navigate. And again, another very famous test pilot, Chris Taylor, who's the CAA's civilian chief test pilot for many years, always said, point the aircraft to where your car's parked. Because at very least, if you're going to have your incident, you might as well be able to drive home afterwards. I'm not quite sure that's entirely the way, but certainly point the aeroplane in a sensible direction. Try not to go away from your nearest available runway. And I remember as a student, a very bored instructor once saying to me, right, where are we going in the event of an engine failure? And I'm pointing out very nice fields to him. And he said, how about that airport over there? So, you do need to think about that. If you want to need a field for a forced landing, just try and remember where the wind was blowing from when you took off. Try and line yourself up so you're landing somewhere near into wind. And don't forget the 5 S's: slope, size, shape, surface, and surroundings. If you remember those 5 S's, use that as a selection criteria for the bit of grass you're going to park on. You've got a pretty good chance of an outcome. Third one, communicate. And there's a good reason it's third one down the list, because actually, unless they've got a very long ladder in the tower, they're not going to be able to do an awful lot to help you. So the important thing on communicate is, if you do get on the radio, get the other 2 things sorted first, because then you can tell them about the issue. It may well be that they then know where to send the fire engine, but it might also just be a simple case of them clearing airspace to allow you an unimpeded approach to an airfield. You can always make a PAN call rather than a mayday call, PAN, which means that I've got a problem, but it's not a full-blown emergency. If you are between frequencies, don't even know where you are, 121.5 is your friend. 121.5 to the D&D, the distress and diversion channel, and they will even give you a fix of where you are. They will put you over to an air traffic controller at an airfield nearby to you, and they take a lot of workload away from you, and they are sitting there waiting to help you. So it really is very, very important that you can do that. And finally, and only if there is time really, have a quick review of the situation. Are things working out okay? Am I still feeling comfortable and in control of the situation? And if you do it in that order, you've taken an awful lot of the doubt away from the emergency that you've just been faced with. And you are operating to something probably that you've rehearsed before, and perhaps even have rehearsed quite frequently. So that's an important one. If we go to the next slide, I'll do a little bit of a there was I with nothing on the Cockpit. And this is a very simple aeroplane. It's called the Tipsy Trainer. It's the picture that's behind me on the. You probably can't see me on the screen at the moment. 1938 design, beautiful little open cockpit, side-by-side aircraft, chuntering over the Chiltern Hills, which is the backdrop there. Beautiful summer's evening, enjoying the sunset. About 20 minutes away from my base at Bicester, and all of a sudden there's a loud bang, 5 hammer blows. The crankshaft has snapped in half, and the engine stopped instantly. Basically 3 things there. One, that is definitely a time sensitive emergency. I reckon that even with the gliding qualities of the Tipsy, I had around about 25 seconds from the engine stopping to actually being parked on the ground and preparing to meet the farmer. So it doesn't take too long. Nice little airfield there just behind me, or a little field rather, nice bit of newly cut hay. That reads all the criteria of shape, size. Would I have been able to do a 360 and get into that if I had the wind at my back on that? Possibly not. I'd be looking for the next field ahead, not the one behind me. If you're above 2,000 feet, you've got a lot more options. At 1,200 feet, that would have been a field that I would not have safely got into. But again, shape, size, slope. That one looks like it's running downhill quite a bit. Could be a bit sporting if you come in over through the gap between those trees at the end, and then found yourself running downhill and not daring to hit the brakes. Although you're far better off, of course, hitting a far hedge than clipping a bunch of trees on the way in. And surroundings, well, that one is actually pretty lacking in surroundings. I don't see any wires across it, which is a good thing. But the one I chose, or the field that chose me, had some bungalows at the side of it. So I was pretty sure if it all really had gone wrong, there was a fighting chance of somebody coming to help me. And all of those things are actually happen very quickly indeed. I did a few things wrong, and Matt will probably come up with a few things with his diagnosis section in a minute. But this was a simple aeroplane, low altitude, relatively low speed. I very nearly messed it up though by getting too close to the field as I turned onto final, and was having to do some pretty bonkers side slipping and S-turning in order to get into the field at the end of it. But I duly did. And again, that was a classic one where the slope actually ran away from me. I actually landed down one side of the field so I could do an L-shaped turn at the end to give me a bit more landing run. only to discover that where I was turning into the L shape, there was actually quite a steep downhill slope at the last bit of the field into a stream. Luckily, I stopped before I got my feet wet. So that's one where I could say I put a few of these things into practice. The luck of the fool helped me, I think, and that's where Matt is going to come in now and have an analysis of how to diagnose and how to make an emergency a little bit less traumatic. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Steve. It's fascinating to hear, you know, a real life story like that. You know, there's, I guess, there's those that have experienced it and had it happen to those, and those of us that are still about to have that experience as well. I've had one, so I'm hoping statistically I'm okay for a bit as well. So, yeah, so DODAR, some of you may have heard of this, and you're probably thinking, oh no, it's an airline thing and they're trying to bring in airline stuff and all the rest of it down to us as well. Well, yes, if you're in a multi-crew environment, you're in your Airbus A350, you might have a lot of time to do all of this in a very controlled manner and all the rest of it. But it's something that you may want to think about in the light aircraft sphere as well. And I would offer to most of you that actually you probably instinctively do this. This is probably how you instinctively think through things, even if you don't necessarily call it by an acronym. So what have we got here? D, diagnose. So what is the problem? What's just happened? Then O, options. Right, what am I going to do? Am I going to hold? Am I going to divert? Do I have to get straight down on the ground? Decide, right, what am I going to do? And then A, act or assign. So get on with it, basically, or assign tasks, or you know, action, whatever it is you're going to do. And that decide and assign are really, really important steps, because once you've made that decision, you then need to get on with it. And I think this is exactly what Steve said. What was it? 25 seconds, I think I heard Steve say. So Steve went through that DODA very quickly. You know, it was a kind of engine's gone bang. What are my options? My only option is to land. I'm deciding I'm going to do that. Then he got on with it. Brilliant. You know, if you take too long to get through those first stages, that's when you're going to be in trouble, especially if you've only got a 25 seconds, you know, bang to being on the ground as well. R at the end, review. Yes, if we've got time, it is great to go back and review what's happening. So if you're, you know, carrying out a diversion, you might want to review, is the aircraft still holding height? Am my engine getting worse? You know, am I still going in the right direction? Have I done everything that I can do as well? And I can see in the chat box some people are coming up with quite similar things as well. Somebody's come up there with problem, information, options, select, evaluate. So yeah, evaluate, very similar to review as well. If you've got time, you know, just take a few seconds to think, am I doing everything right? Is there anything more I could do? Do I need to get any more help from anybody or anything like that? So DODAR, have a think about it. And if you're sat having coffee and cake on the sofa one night, that's what, you know, doing our flying, maybe run through, you know, scribble DODAR on your pad and just think through some emergencies and think what steps you would take with those as well. If we go to the next slide, please. So here you go. This was an engine failure in flight. These are the things we must do. And then it's what I was talking about at the end. Have we got time to review the situation? Have we got time to evaluate it, as somebody else called it there as well? So those in red, those are the things, the DODA, those are the things we must do and get on with. If we've got time, we can review, brief passengers and things like that as well. Okay. And again, a few people are picking up in the chat there as well, but we're far more likely to identify the problem and diagnose it quickly if you're familiar with all of your engine and operating systems. Yeah, totally agree for that. Definitely, the better you can know your aircraft, that's a really good point.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Matt, isn't it? And if we apply that back to Steve, since we've got you in the room as well, Steve, you know, you had an engine failure. Select, you know, what are your options? Select the glide attitude straight away, complete the memory items where it's gone bang. You do that, you know, do those pretty quickly. They're your memory items. You're already pointing in a suitable direction. As you said before, that field kind of chose you. And, you know, 25 seconds until you're on the ground from 1,200 feet. there's probably not a lot of time for review in there, is there? I mean, you're not exactly going, you know what, the field in front of me is not suitable, I think I'll change my mind. You're kind of committed at that point, I guess.
And I'll hold my hand up and say I didn't do it all right, because I only turned the fuel tap off after I'd landed. I was a bit too, found myself too busy to remember to do that one.
And for those, sorry, before we move on, and for those of you that haven't read Steve's article that he wrote for us, I would commend you to do it, because he's doing himself a disservice this evening. But having read it, it's well worth a read, and it's really, really good. So I'd just like to say thank you for that, Steve, anyway, but before we move on with the rest of it. So back to you, Matt.
Actually, just interesting picking up on a discussion on chat regarding whether the if time and capacity brief passengers check harnesses tight and locked and doors closed. Now, some people are saying it's better to have the door unlatched, because if the airframe distorts on landing, you can therefore exit the aircraft easier. Is it worth having a discussion on that?
Yeah, I think again it depends on your aircraft type and your POH and things like that. Some other aircraft types are flown, especially with a canopy, a sliding canopy. The recommendation is that you ensure the canopy is closed and locked in the event of a rollover accident, because it provides structural strength to the aircraft as well, and protects the applicants. So yeah, doors could be unlatched as well, but other aircraft types, you know, one of the drills may be to ensure the canopy is closed and latched for that structural strength. Steve, I mean, you didn't even have one, did you, at all? So,
no, that was very useful in that respect. But equally, if it had overturned, I do fly open cockpit aeroplanes these days with a hard helmet, because at very least, if my head's going to be the crumple zone, at least I'll have something to protect it. But what I would say there is also, as you say, it depends on the type of aircraft. For example, the Slingsby Firefly, the last thing you want to do with that clamshell type cockpit is unlatch it, because if that comes open in flight as you're coming over the hedge, you're going to assume the drag characteristics of a semi-detached house very quickly indeed, because it literally opens up into the airflow, and you will generate what I would call even a helicopter auto rotation won't be that steep.
Fair one. Great. Okay.
Brilliant.
Back to you, Matt.
Okay. So we'll move on then. So emergency handling pitfalls then. So we decided to just pick maybe the top 5, which we're going to have a look at in a minute after a poll. And these are, you know, things that I discussed with other examiners and other senior instructors as well. But before we get into those 5, let's have a look at the poll and see what people think. So what would you consider to be the most common error pilots make when dealing with an emergency? Misdiagnosing the problem, rushing into the drill, doing the wrong drill, or not flying the aircraft. Again, no right or wrong answers with these at all. We haven't got any statistics behind this. There's no things. We're interested in what people's views are out in the community out there. Let's have a look at the answers. So not flying the aircraft as well, which is interesting, isn't it? So I don't disagree with everybody, but if you think back to that earlier poll, 99% of people said flying the aircraft was the most important thing to do. So if we all know it's the most important thing to do, why do we not do it? And that's human factors at play again, isn't it? Definitely so. Distraction, startle factor, like Steve mentioned, and things like that as well. So interesting linkage there as well with that. Thank you. All right, so let's move on then. So the top 5 that I'm going to look at here, you can see them on the screen there as well. Okay, so these are just 5 things we'll just cover in the next 5 minutes or so. So the first one then, handling engine malfunctions. So you're probably thinking, what on earth is Matt going on about now? What is a malfunction? It's engine failures. It's FARTOs. We've been calling that for years as well. Well, I'm suggesting you might want to think about these things as engine malfunctions. And why do I say that? If we could have the next slide, please. So I suggest to you engine malfunctions can come in 3 categories. We can either have a mechanical failure, a non-mechanical failure, or we can have an engine fire. So characteristics of mechanical failure: prop stops, oil loss, Mach noise. That's the big bang. That's what Steve talked about in his situation there as well. The engine is kaput. It's not going to help you again on that flight. And the key thing there is that can then funnel us down that thing. We're not going to attempt to restart. We can prioritize on the forced landing. We can concentrate on that. Same with the fire. If we've got a fire, flames, smoke, we're not going to attempt to restart and use that engine. The priority is to shut down, secure the engine, and then you know, make a safe forced landing there as well. And incidentally, with a fire, it comes back to that review that I talked about as well. We might want to try and review, has the fire gone out? Because if it hasn't gone out, flying the most perfect forced landing pattern might not be the right thing to do. The most important thing to do if the fire hasn't gone out is to literally get on the ground with whatever's in front of you and accept it as well. Non-mechanical failure then, so things like propellers, windmill, and we've got some rough running, we've got a slight RPM drop, MEP, manifold pressure. If we notice that dropping off, so I noticed somebody, a few people mentioning that in the chat there as well. That might be the case. We need to prioritize aviating, navigating, communicating. But in that case, if we've got the time, we might want to attempt a restart. We might want to try and restore power and get it back there as well. So there you go. Have a look at that. That might be something to consider. Engine malfunctions and what kind of leg of my decision tree am I going to go down? Okay, next slide, please. So when to brief as well. In flight tests and that, as examiners, often we get a bit of confusion between the kind of briefings that people are delivering as part of their flying. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that I believe there's two main emergency briefs that we should ideally do in light aircraft operation. If you could have a slide, please. The first one is the passenger safety briefing. There you go. Safety is a little format there that you might want to use to cover the things, or you might want to make up a little, you know, like passenger safety card, a bit like getting the airliners for your particular aircraft. But when you want to be doing that, I suggest to you is before engine start, this is when you're getting your friends or your family or whoever you're taking flying, when you're getting them in the aircraft, walk them around the aircraft. It's slow time. Give them a chance to have a look and feel at things, give them a chance to ask questions, have a discussion, make it all a nice experience. It's a non-rushed thing that you're doing there as well. The second briefing that you might want to do then is the pre-takeoff emergencies brief. And this, ideally, I would suggest is something that you do at the hold or quite close to takeoff there as well. And what you're trying to do here is precondition your brain in order for any preparations during the initial departure. Okay, so you're trying to just precondition your thinking as well. PEDS, it's a little format. You might want to think about it as well. So have we got any performance considerations? If we're in a short field, if we're not airborne or have got sufficient speed by this point, are we going to abort? Emergencies, what am I going to do if I have an engine malfunction before liftoff with runway remaining once we're outside of the airfield? And you could also include, if you wanted, a bit about your departure routing and any special procedures or a stop altitude. And that's a bit of threat error management for airspace and things like that. For example, I was flying out of Coventry with somebody in a Piper Arrow, climbs fairly well, and we did this and said to ourselves, we've got to remember to level off at 1400 so we don't go into the Birmingham airspace at 1500, a classic trap there at Coventry. So that's something that might be good to consider. But do try and split them up. Don't try and do the passenger safety brief when you're at the hold, all ready to go with a stack of aircraft behind you, is what I suggest to you.
So just before we move off that one, Matt,
Yep.
as a matter of interest, I'll take a straw poll between the two of you now. No right or wrong answers. For the takeoff emergencies brief, do you do that if you're on your own? Anyone else can put it in the chat box as well. Matt, Steve, what do you do?
I do. I run through. I certainly run through a contingencies brief in my head, even if I don't actually verbalize it. And actually, sometimes if you've got a passenger who's a little bit nervous, actually just saying to them that if we had an emergency, this is what I would do. Actually gives them a bit of confidence as well, that they know you're thinking about it.
How about
the
you,
other
Matt?
thing Yes, I do. And the other thing I recommend you do is you tailor that to the conditions of the day. It's very easy to go through this kind of recitable script, but you just give every time. But actually, you need to think to yourself. People say, well, if I'm an engine failure and I can't land ahead, I'm going to pick a field and land outside the airfield boundary. Lots of people say that. But what is the wind on the day? So are you going to turn left or right? Are you going to go straight ahead? Is there a particular built-up area that means you have to go a different way? So, you know, try and tailor it to the situation and the airfield, and that exactly where you're flying on the day, I think is a good thing to do.
And just to complete the three of us, I do exactly that as well. So I apply, in fact, I verbalize it, and I always apply it to the weather of the day as well. I have done for years, and it's a habit now which I can't get out of. So, and I think that's pretty useful. Back to you,
Great
Matt.
stuff. Thanks. Moving on, a slide, please. So here we go. Checks. Perfection is the enemy of the good, to use a cliche. We've already talked about this. We've already touched on this as well, and Steve has pulled on it in his example as well. You know, depending on where you get an engine failure or a situation, what height you're at, you're going to have differing amounts of time. But this is all about trying to be wary of distraction at this stage. I mean, the one on the right, TriStar, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, 1972, if you want to Google or read about it. This was an accident that really started off the whole human factors study, and that in aviation from top to bottom, from general aviation right up to commercial. And this crash occurred, the entire cockpit crew, they were preoccupied with a burnt out landing light indicator, spending a lot of time trying to resolve that. And what they failed to notice was the autopilot had inadvertently been disconnected. The aircraft gradually lost altitude and crashed into the Everglades. So you think, well, that's a pretty extreme example, Matt. You know, how's that relevant to GA? Well, little article that I pulled off BBC News in the last few weeks on the left. There's an AIB report you can read on that. There was an accident, instructor and a student. They had a door come open during the flight. Very distracting, lots of things going on, lots of human factors, but they ended up crashing short of the runway on approach. And only last month I saw in the AIBs, there was a pilot of a Beach Baron. He had an electrical problem, quite a bit of a tricky one, wasn't straightforward, but he was dealing with that in the Gloucester area, got very distracted, ran out of fuel and lost one engine on final approach, and tried to do a go around, but obviously the engine had gone, so ended up sort of a runway excursion to the side of the runway. So so it can happen to us as well. Next one, please. So know your flows, and again, we've already touched on this, so this is just to reinforce it. Initial actions, if you know your aircraft, you know your systems, and you know your way around the cockpit of the aircraft you're flying, it can stop, you know, rather than trying to remember a list of items and action them. If we know the flow of things, it's going to help us action them in a kind of using our muscle memory fashion here as well. Here's a typical PA-28 cockpit. Engine shut down because of a failure or a fire. If we kind of go right to left and then down in that left arrow fashion, that will get most of the key things that we need to do: mixture throttle, you know, ignition off, activate the ELT, turn the fuel off. And it'd be the same if we were checking for resolution items during a rough running. We could go right to left and check those items there as well. The other thing I'd like to point out as well is, and it's quite often people miss this, and I often forget to mention it to people as well when I'm instructing examining. Look at the red controls there as well. So the red controls in the aircraft design are those that are basically critical emergency action ones according to the FARS design specs. There you go: mixture, main switch, the ELT, and the fuel. Yeah, they're all coloured bright red. So items, things that you'll need to action as critical ones in an emergency, are all coloured bright red. So next time you go flying, have a look around your aircraft that you're flying, see what controls are coloured bright red. Or if you're designing or building your own aircraft, you might want to think about the colour coding that you're going to apply in your aircraft. Something to think about maybe as well. Okay, and the last one, final slide, please. So resource management as well. Again, you know, this is all about using every resource available to you. We've already covered using air traffic control, D&D. What about other people with you? We mentioned it. You know, passengers, they might be able to help. They might be scared. They might be nervous. They might be more trouble than the worst. You've got to really assess on the day who you've got with you, what experience that they've got with you. It might be a partner or a family member that flies with you a lot. They might be really, really capable of getting out a checklist and finding the right page in it to help you. It might be a first-time flyer, but actually you need them to sit back calm and keep their hands and feet away from the controls. You might also be flying with other pilots as well. In this case, the other pilot may be very capable on the type as well. So they might be able to do radio calls while you fly the aircraft, or they might be able to set the transponder emergency code for you, or, you know, get the map out and help with a diversion. So it might be really useful. But the only caution I would offer to that is coming back to our human factors again as well. Always be very clear about who's doing what. And remember, you should always be clear before takeoff who's the aircraft commander, who's ultimately in charge. And like I said, the time to have that is part of those pre-takeoff, those pre-flight discussions, rather than in the air as well. Always be clear who's doing what in any emergency situation. A really good, useful discussion to have. So those are just 5 things, like little hot topics or pitfalls that, like say, chatting to some of my examiner friends. These are some of the things that we came up with over a coffee, that we kind of see regularly on tests and renewals and revalidations. So something that you may or may wish to think about. Chris, that's the end of my section, I think.
I think it is. Thank you. Just picking back up in the chat box, some really good stuff in there. Lots of people agreeing, and lots of people saying that they do verbalise or go through a pre-takeoff emergency brief, which is good to see. Really interesting point in there from Momin regarding human factors in terms of making sure you do touch drills. Because as we've talked about already, like the startle factor and, you know, and that distraction means that potentially, you know, you're going to be unable to do those as quick as you might like to, depending on the nature of the emergency. Chloe's been putting some stuff in the chat box. There's a link to Steve's articles in there as well. As I said to everyone before, I thoroughly recommend a good read of that if you have the time. Right then, yes, please give us some questions. We've only got one so far, so I'm going to start asking Steve lots of questions on his article if he's not careful. Right, I'll start with a question. I've got a question here from Greg. He said, after engine failure after takeoff, some people say never ever turn back towards the airfield, but others say it can be an option. What do you think?
Well, I'll jump in first.
Go for it.
Depends on your aeroplane. If you're flying something like a 200 horsepower pitch special and you get airborne and before the airfield perimeter you're at 1,500 feet, the chances are you're going to be able to do a reasonable turn back and land back on the airfield. If you're flying most GA types, you will probably have less than 500, 600 feet at the end of the airfield. You will not, I repeat, not have room to attempt to turn back. Even my J3 Piper Cub, which is one of the most benign aeroplanes of the world, it will lose about 600 feet in a power off 270-degree turn to land back across onto an airfield. It will not, unless you've got that sort of height plus another 100 or so for the prop drag and everything else, it won't do it. And there is a simple fact. Sadly, I've attended the funerals of 2 pilots who attempted turnbacks after engine failures, and it didn't work for them. If you attempt to turn back and lose control in the turn back, which is what happened in both of those cases, you will almost certainly die. Whatever happens, if you're flying the aeroplane to the scene of the accident in control, you are likely to survive it. And it is quite simple. The Australian AIB have done quite a lot of research on the fact, and I think they said that something like 48% of turnbacks resulted in an accident, and almost all of those were fatal. So it's a case of knowing your aeroplane. I'm not going to say thou shalt do or shalt not, but for the most of the aeroplanes that we are flying, and we don't fly high performance aircraft with meteoric rates of climb. I should think a tornado, if you had a double engine, or typhoon, if you had a double engine failure in a vertical climb out of Coningsby, passing 28,000 feet, you might have a fighting chance of sorting it out. But for me and my Piper Cub, or for as in a PA-28 or whatever, I'm just going to go straight ahead. I'm going to make my plans probably 20 to 30 degrees max either side of the heading on takeoff, and sort it out from there.
Sounds good. Anything else to add on that, Matt?
No, I mean, we do fly practice turnbacks in the Grob Tutor that I fly for the Air Force, and it's quite an aggressive maneuver, as Steve says. So we don't really initiate them much below 700 feet for practice. It's quite an aggressive pitch down to get the attitude for the right airspeed. Quite an aggressive application of angle of bank to get around and get back as well. And the key thing is, you've got to be very current and very quick at doing it to make it a success, as Steve says. So I think for the majority of us that are maybe flying different types, or our currencies up and down, it's not necessarily the best course of action. However, said that, I'm not a huge fan of saying never turn back or never turn. But what I am a fan of saying is you may need to turn towards a more suitable landing area. So that is a possibility. So, you know, directly what's ahead of you may not always be suitable. There's certain airfields and runways where you may need to turn, not necessarily all the way back, but you may need to turn towards a more suitable landing area. If anybody ever flew into the old Sheffield airport, that was certainly one where you'd need to turn on takeoff as well. And if I remember rightly, Steve, there's a couple of runways at Bicester where you need to turn, I think, isn't there, away from what's ahead? Yeah, I think so.
Well, the runways at Bicester, as we fly at the moment, the airfield I fly from there, it used to be omnidirectional. That was great. You could go anywhere. Yeah. But the marked runways now, actually, there are gentle turns. To Western's another one, a 15-degree turn after departure on both its main runways. Yeah. Are needed for noise abatement as much as anything. Somebody once said that it makes a shed load more noise if you lose control in the turn and dump it in a heap. But what I would say there is that it's a decision that each pilot needs to think about, and that's where your contingencies brief comes in as well. And can I just also say to Steve Todd from British Aerobatics, love to take you on your offer of the demonstration of the pitch special with 200 horsepower engine.
Okay, thanks, gents. Okay, we've got another one here from Chris Lent. It's an interesting one, actually. How do you safely ditch a high wing aircraft that has a tricycle undercarriage? He says he flies a C-42. How do you safely ditch a high wing aircraft that has a tricycle undercarriage?
Can I jump in first?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, for a start, there is no safe way to ditch an aeroplane. You're going to get your feet wet. Obviously, if it is a situation where you're going to have to do it, you have to do it. And everyone tells you, of course, to land along the line of the swell and into the wave trough. Obviously, with a nose wheel aircraft, you will be needing to get it as slow as possible and as nose high as possible. And that might actually mean you might even consider reducing the amount of flap, because an aircraft flying slowly with no flap has a much higher nose attitude. But even then, when the main wheels hit that water, that nose is going to go down with a big splash. And you're going to, as the Navy call it, ship green through the windscreen or on the windscreen. The water is a solid medium. You need to get it well sorted. You've also got to think about your evacuation when it happens. In actual fact, something like a C-42, I suspect, will float reasonably well. You'll probably end up kicking your way out the windscreen, not trying to open the doors anyway. But of course, make sure also that you're in a position that you're not entangled with anything on your way out. Make sure your headset cables removed. Make sure that you undo your belt before you start evacuating the aircraft. All being well, there would be an air bubble in there. This is what the ditching people say. And I'll give a plug for the other safety organisation which works with us, which is GASCO, who organise ditching courses. And they organise those courses, and I think it's right we give them a good plug, because those courses are very useful indeed.
Yeah, very much so. Great, thank you. Here's one, I think, from Matt. Here we go. So this is one from Louise. She hopes to do her PPL skills test next week. I think she's trying to butter you up to be the examiner. But she actually says, any useful hints or tips, please?
Well, there's lots of tips that I can give you about the skills test in general. I've written on this. If there's a few articles around, if you sort of Google and look for it. But the main thing with the emergency drills, like say, I think if you take away what we've talked about here about thinking about what's time sensitive, what's not time sensitive, and just generally understanding the drills and the flows for your skills test and doing that armchair flying as we talked about, that's the best preparation you can do for skills test. And you know what Chris talked about right at the beginning is, so when your examiner gives you some scenarios in your skills test, just take a few seconds to just think about, right, what's the scenario, what am I dealing with, you know, that diagnosing, what are my options, what am I going to do, and then get on with it. And if you get chance, review it. And remember, for your skills test as well, as an examiner, what we're looking for is safe outcomes, not techniques as well. So if you're doing a practice forced landing, for example, what we're looking for is, would it have resulted in a safe outcome? Would the aircraft have landed in a suitable area, a suitable speed, you know, and positioned well? We're not looking for the most perfect technique. It's, would it have resulted in a safe outcome? And as Steve has quite rightly touched on as well, if you don't do any checks, and you know, you don't do any checks, but you keep control of the aircraft, that's the absolute priority. What you can't afford to do is have the most perfect set of checks recited from memory, but have the stall warner chirping off because you're not controlling the aircraft and getting very slow. That will get your examiner more nervous than anything. So but all the best, good luck, let us know how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it. Good for you. Okay, thank you. Right, we've got another one here. This one's from Judith. She's talking about a practice engine failure. So if she has an engine failure, she then says she turns onto downwind whilst trimming for glide speed. Should she do this?
I don't know if Judith's talking about in the circuit or at height, really. I'm not entirely sure.
I think it's the circuit. Judith, let us know. Is it the circuit?
Oh, at height. Yeah. Okay. So this is very much what some schools teach, and certainly what the gliding community may teach and look at as well, is turning downwind. And the idea is that if you've got height and you've got time, it gives you a better option, better choice of landing areas, because you've got that higher ground speed, so you've got more ground to cover and more landing areas as well. I would say, I think as we've talked about, it's very, very situational dependent on this as well. You've got to look at where you are, what your options are around. If you've got the most perfect field down there in front of you, well, you know, I wouldn't want to turn away from that. I wouldn't want to lose sight of it. I wouldn't want to lose the ability to plan my way around it. But if the landing areas ahead of you are not a great choice, yeah, maybe turning downwind and using some distance to go and fly to a better area is the best thing to do.
Great, thanks, Matt. This will be the last, or maybe second to last question. See how quickly we get it answered. This one's from Tarek. It says, most engine failures are partial failures, yet we train exclusively for complete failures. How should the instructors amongst us implement that in training?
I'll start, and then I'll be interested to see what Steve's thoughts are from the LAA and the coaching point of view on this one as well. I wholeheartedly agree. A few people have commented on this in the box as well. Absolutely. Our teaching on engine failure is far too much, you know, close the throttle all the way, go to idle from full power, and then we go through the drills and all the rest of it. I think as the Australian studies proved, that a lot of engine failures will be partial. That non-mechanical failure I talked about, loss of power, rough running and things like that. How do you deal with that? Very much more difficult to deal with. I have written on this, and Chris will have to see whether we can recycle that article actually maybe to put on there, because there's quite a lot to discuss in this that we can't really have the time for here. So we'll perhaps see if we can recycle that article and put it out via the website. That would be a useful thing to do. But ultimately, it's aviate, navigate, communicate once again. So it's about pitching down, selecting your best glide attitude and getting a good glide speed. And then what I recommend you do, you've got to assess the situation. Am I losing height? If so, I probably need to commit to a forced landing ahead. Can I maintain height or even climb a little bit? If that's the answer, so then maybe I can turn towards a more suitable landing area and take a bit of time to try and recover the situation, look at my drills as well. But very difficult situation. I really recommend that instructors and students practice it and go and do it. So for your next hour with an instructor, why don't you go and do some time in the circuit and practice partial engine failure scenarios from different heights? A massively valuable thing to do, and there's some really good training value from it. Like I say, I'd be interested to see what Steve thinks from a coaching point of view, though, with some of the LAA types.
Absolutely, and also particularly with vintage types as well, because there is a sort of wisdom which I disproved, that vintage engines tend to give up gracefully, and they tend to drop a cylinder. Particularly radials will blow a cylinder off, throw oil everywhere, pop and bang, vomit white smoke, but will chunter along still giving about 75 or 80% power. It's all about decision making, though, isn't it? It is you making, and actually the big challenge with a partial engine failure is you've got a lot more decisions to make. There was a case of a P51 at Duxford about 3 years ago during a formation display, and it had a carburetor fault, and the engine shut down, picked up, shut down, picked up, shut down, picked up. And the pilot attempted to land back on the airfield. And as he turned base leg, he realized it wasn't going to happen. And he made all the right decisions. He retracted the gear and put the aircraft into a cornfield. Okay, it wasn't helped by the fact that when they were bringing it back on the truck, they wanged a set of traffic lights with the wings, but that wasn't his fault. But the simple fact is that he said he had between 22 and 32 potentially life-changing decisions to make in that sort of minute he was in the air trying to make all of that happen. That's a high workload. So if you've got a partial engine failure, be ready for it to be a high workload. Actually, if you've got a way of making a safe force landing with the throttle closed, make that decision, then it's sorted.
Great, thanks. And on that note, that kind of brings us right back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is, as you've eloquently put there, decision making, knowing those touch drills, know your memory items, because if you've got to make 30 odd life-changing decisions in a minute, you need to know your aeroplane inside out, I would suggest, because when it goes wrong, it could go wrong pretty quickly. Lovely. Thank you ever so much to both of you. And thank you to everybody for coming, really. We really hope that you've taken something away from this. It's been a really interesting chat with Matt and Steve this evening, and it's been great for all of the inputs that you guys have had. So I've certainly really enjoyed this one particularly. There's a bunch of other resources that we will provide or can provide for you, and that's all on our website. I've mentioned that already. You can see the details on the screen. We've got another couple of workshops coming up. The next one's going to be on weather, so you can sign up for that now. And then the next one after that, I think, Matt, is going to be departures, arrivals, and RT, isn't it? So we've got some stuff coming up over the next couple of months. So please do get involved in that. And if you are social media orientated, please do follow us on any of those channels you can see on the screen there. So it's, like I say, I've really enjoyed this one. Sorry to see it go, but it's been great fun. And thank you ever so much again to Matt. Thanks ever so much to Steve. And I'll hopefully see you all again next time. Thanks, chaps.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.